So let's get started with the MiniBrute 2 sound generation section. We've got two oscillators, VCO1 and VCO2. VCO1 is these 8 controls and these 5 faders here, and VCO2 is just this fader and these few little controls in this section here. First thing we have is some waveform faders. Rather than on some synths you select between waveforms, here we just fade up whichever thing we want, and we can make combinations as well as hear them individually. So there is a sawtooth, square wave pulse, a triangle, noise source, and lastly external. Now external is an input on the patchbay where you can send any sound you like into the MiniBrute from another synthesizer if you want to. That's currently not got anything connected to it, but that's where you bring it up. Now we can make combinations of these sound sources. So you've got quite a palette there just messing around with the varying levels. Now let's leave the sawtooth up and have a look at the controls above. We've got fine tune. That simply allows you to pitch VCO1 up or down slightly more than an octave. Next to that is glide. Now if I play notes on the keyboard, the pitch instantly switches to the note I'm playing. If I increase the glide amount, you'll hear that it starts to slur between them. So there's up to 3 seconds of glide there. Down here we've got frequency modulation. Now frequency modulation is where you send another signal into the pitch of VCO1 to create interesting pitch effects, and often they can be quite ugly and atonal. Underneath where it says FM, frequency modulation, you can see it has written in blue VCO2 in brackets. These blue bracket labels on the synth generally refer to a signal that is ordinarily being sent to this destination unless you choose to put something else in the patch bay. So if we don't use the patch bay at all, it's VCO2 that comes in and frequency modulates VCO1, and that sounds like this. So it's great for making interesting tones and effects. Obviously, the effect you get will depend on the frequency of VCO2, whether that's set to is going to change this tone. So for example, if I So it's a really interesting complex interaction between the two oscillators. Next we have ultrasaw. Now this only works on the sawtooth, so we'll leave it up again. Ultrasaw amount essentially is an effect whereby the MiniBrute makes copies of the sawtooth you have here and detunes them slightly away from the original and keeps them ever so slightly moving. Their pitch never kind of settles. The end result is you get this nice chorusy phasing effect, very similar to the old string synthesizers. You hear it coming in now. Okay, so that's ultrasaw. Next we have pulse width and pulse width modulation. So let's bring the pulse waveform up because that's the only one that these controls affect. So there we go, we have our basic square. And if I move pulse width myself, you'll see that that square becomes a narrower and narrower, what's called pulse width. You'll see on the oscilloscope now. Now at the full setting it doesn't quite vanish. Some synths take that pulse width to the point where the sound actually vanishes into a thin nothing. This one we've still got a little reedy thin pulse there. Pulse width modulation below it, you can see it's being routed by LFO1, so essentially what's happening is that LFO1, instead of me doing this by hand, effectively LFO1 is kind of doing that automatically, but rather than having a motorized robotic MiniBrute 2, Arturia simply put a pulse width modulation depth, and this controls how much of that signal from LFO1 is fed to create that effect, and you'll hear it now. So that's pulse width and pulse width modulation. Next we've got, on the triangle wave, we have a thing called the Metalizer. So here's our dry, simple triangle wave, okay? If I increase the Metalizer, you'll see what happens. It's a kind of wave folding circuit, which in terms of sound means that it creates loads of really interesting harmonics by folding the top of this triangle back down on itself, you see? The more I increase it, the more complex that gets. That's an absolutely lovely effect. Below that we've got Metal Mod. Now what this is exactly the same as Metalizer, but it's a way of modulating in the same way that pulse width modulates the pulse width. Metal Mod does the same for Metalizer. Now in this case, instead of being swung round and round and round and round by an LFO, it's actually triggered by the velocity I hit the notes with. Now if it's set to nothing, nothing happens, but if I stick it up all the way to full, what happens is that as I hit the notes with different velocities, tone constantly changes according to how hard I've struck the note. These two are linked. If Metalizer is already set to full, Metal Mod has almost no effect, like a tiny change between soft and loud notes. So you have to have some sort of, as it were, like headroom left. You have to have Metalizer back here maybe to actually hear any kind of additional metalizing from velocity. If Metalizer is set to nothing, this has a full range from absolutely nothing to full and in between. So that's oscillator 1. Oscillator 2, a much simpler affair. We've got a tune knob here. Let's bring oscillator 2 up so we can hear it. So there we go, oscillator 2 level up. Okay. As with oscillator 1, an octave or so of range. However, we can change that. Here there's a little switch. It says range, fine, all, LFO. We're currently set to fine, which is the same as fine tune on VCO1. If I set it to all, this range knob now covers the entire distance that the VCO2 can reproduce. So you get a huge amount of sweep in there. If I put it on LFO, you'll hear just click. Now you'll just faintly hear some little sub-bass rumble there. As I slow it down, you can hear it actually going down into the subaudible frequencies. It's now acting in the same range as an LFO. So if you need a third LFO, we've already got 1, 2 on the synth anyway. But if you need a third LFO, you can switch oscillator 2 into being an LFO. Just out of interest, I'll quickly show you what effect that has over in frequency modulation. I'll turn oscillator 2 off because we don't want to hear it. We just want to use it to frequency modulate oscillator 1. So here is our sawtooth. And if I now put the FM depth up, that really slow oscillator 2 is going to sweep the pitch of oscillator 1. Instead of making that really complex, interesting interaction, it's going to make something closer to a vibrato. You see, and if I increase the pitch of oscillator 2, now it's behaving as an LFO, you'll hear that that makes. So you can use oscillator 2 as an LFO. It can be routed anywhere, not just to the frequency modulation of VCO1. And yeah, if I just stick that back on all, you'll hear the effect that a huge range has on the frequency modulation. So this is when the VCO2 is sweeping across about 8 octaves or so. So hopefully there you can hear the connection between the sort of slow pitch sweeps in a frequency modulation which create vibrato, and as they get faster and faster they actually create tonalities. Okay, so that's the pitch range of VCO2. Lastly, it's got a waveform selector. So unlike VCO1 where we fade up whichever amount of the waveform we want, on Oscillator 2 we simply switch. So we have a sine wave, a sawtooth, a square pulse. That's the oscillator section on the MiniBrute 2. That all gets fed across into the filter, which we'll look at next.
Thanks everybody for watching, commenting and indeed liking. We really do appreciate all the support we get here on our Sonic Academy YouTube channel. So if you found this video super useful, please, we'd love you to hit the subscribe button. We update the YouTube channel every week with new content. And if you want to watch some more relevant content, just click on the videos beside me.